Yeah, it's 9th of December 2025 and it's exactly 14:30 Central European Winter Time. A very warm welcome to the Netherlands, welcome to The Hague, to the city of peace and justice. However, it's good morning for those who are joining us from the other side of the Atlantic, and it's good evening for those who come in from the very far east. Thanks for expressing your interest in our today's topic by joining our today's online seminar, Climate Change Uncovered. As usual, please allow me to briefly introduce you to our virtual guidelines of this seminar. During the entire seminar, we kindly ask you to keep your microphone muted. During the discussions, please click on the hand symbol and switch on your camera if you would like to speak. You will find the respective symbol next to your name in the participants list. You may also use the chat to ask questions, to comment, and to share any topic-related literature. Please note that every speaker presents their own thoughts and expertise. Please also note that the seminar presentations will be recorded. Chatham House rules apply for the second part of our today's online seminar, the Q&A session, which therefore won't be recorded. Before continuing, allow us to introduce ourselves as your today's moderators.
Hello everyone, my name is Sonja and I'm currently working in the Concepts, Interoperability and Capabilities branch here at the CCOE. And I'm looking forward to being your moderator today and to guiding you through the webinar together with Ralph.
With that said, I'm Ralph Bauer, known to looking at the participants list to almost everybody online. Very warm welcome again to our today's online seminar. We hope you have the chance to enjoy our today's seminar with the topic as just addressed. Let's go ahead. Let's take a quick look at our today's agenda. We are pleased to have with us a panel of distinguished speakers who will share their perspectives on how climate change is shaping defense decision-making and responsibilities. Note that we had last-minute change to our today's agenda. Thankfully, Lieutenant Colonel Kim Vetting, whom we are going to meet in a minute, representing the NATO Climate Change and Security Center of Excellence, jumped in to give a general introduction to the topic, referring to NATO's climate change and security agenda, thereby setting the scene for our today's online seminar. Kim will continue by taking a closer look into NATO climate change, climate security action plan, as this represents his current field of work. After the first break, we will be listening to Ms. Katharina Wong from the United Nations Development Programme, who will present a humanitarian perspective on the topic of climate change. And finally, we meet Dr. Matthew Rhodes from the Ted Stevens Center for Arctic Security Studies, who will address the impact of climate change within the Arctic region and its implications for NATO and especially NATO civil-military cooperation, CIMIC. Matthew's contribution makes our today's set of presentations complete and leads us to one more break of about 5 minutes before we hit the most exciting part of our today's seminar, where we meet our experts again, ready to respond to your questions and your comments. At about 16:55, we are going to wrap up our today's seminar, take a short look at the 2026 agenda before we closing down by about 1700.
Yes, thank you Ralph for this quick overview about our today's agenda. To set the scope for today's session, I want to highlight how climate change is already shaping our daily lives, often in subtle but powerful ways. We're seeing rapid growth in solar and wind energy, reshaping how countries think about energy security. Our cities are investing in green infrastructure and resilience measures to cope with more frequent heat waves, floods, and extreme weather. Public perception is also shifting, influenced by both greater awareness and widespread misinformation, which affects trust, policy, but also societal stability. At the same time, climate impacts are widening social inequalities, while youth activism is pushing for stronger action and accountability. We're also experiencing accelerating biodiversity loss, along with rising droughts and floods that disrupt food systems, water supplies, and critical infrastructure. All of these changes may seem local or everyday, but collectively they alter the broader security landscape. And that's why they matter for defense and for NATO, because understanding how climate change affects society helps us to understand how it will shape future risk, operations, and strategic priorities. With that, I will hand back to Rolf, who will introduce our first speaker of today.
With pleasure. Thank you very much, Sonja. Let's welcome Lieutenant Colonel Kim Vetting. Kim joined the Climate Change and Security Center of Excellence in 2024 and currently serves as head of the Outreach and Engagement Branch. He's on a 2-year sabbatical from his civilian job as staff member of NATO's military headquarters, SHAPE in Belgium, where he has worked on strategic outreach in the J9 CIMIC branch since 2014. Aside from his work with the Climate Change and Security Center of Excellence and SHAPE, he is a Danish Army reservist assigned to the Danish Joint Arctic Command AKO in Nuuk, Greenland, where he works as the head of liaison officers team, a position he has held since 2019. Educated as a political scientist from Denmark and Germany, he has spent most of his career in development environments, among others 8 years in Kosovo working for the UN and OSCE and the Danish Refugee Council, and shorter civilian deployments to Iraq with NATO and Afghanistan with the UN, before taking up the assignment with NATO in 2014. Kim, it's a pleasure to have you with us, and thanks for dedicating some time to our today's online seminar, and allow me to hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Ralph. Thank you, Sonja. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm happy also to introduce a bit represent NATO HQ, although I'm sad that we could not have a representative here, because I think that will also be in its place. So as already mentioned, I will have the first third of the presentation linked to a NATO HQ presentation on the Climate Change and Security Action Plan, and then I will go more into the work streams that we see at the moment of relevant for the military side before we eventually broaden it up. But perhaps before I start, next slide, just to show that what is actually the NATO Climate Change Center of Excellence. I think most participants are familiar with the concept of NATO Center of Excellence. So we have 30 of them spread around in the NATO countries, but this is a most recent one set up in Canada. I'm currently speaking from Halifax, where we have an Arctic seminar, but otherwise we are normally based in Montreal, and we have the 12 sponsoring nations providing our input here. And basically, our vision is to be a recognized hub of expertise on climate change and security, primarily for the military, but also for civilian experts who work in the security sector. So this is a little bit of us. We are still only on initial operating capability, but hope to actually move in next year into full operational capability when we will have all nations finally represented here at the center. So great to be here, and let's move into the presentation that has kindly been provided by NATO HQ. So as I said, I'm standing in for Mola Kerner-Schindler. She's sitting in the IS International Military Staff, and it's really one of the key focal points at the IMS moving this forward. Next slide, please. So I think a key thing to start with is how NATO overall sees this. So we put the action plan together in 2021, and I come back to why this happened, but the action plan clearly highlight that for us, there's no doubt this is a defining changes and challenges of our time, and it's a threat multiplier across the alliance, both threatening the allied security, but also perhaps our neighborhood in itself, and how that impacts NATO. And how does it do that? Well, let's come back to the core task. Next slide, please. I think we are all familiar with our core tasks moved a little bit forward and changed in 2022. So it's not only about collective defense, it's about deterrence and defense, and it's about that we are being able to understand how also our opponents are basically seeing climate change affecting us. If we're not adapting, then we are not actually deterring. But at the moment, most of our efforts is on crisis prevention and management. We see that across our missions, and I'll come back to that. And in the end, as also highlighted in the action plan, the cooperative security, that we really work together to enhance security, both at home and with our other partners. So climate change is really impacting each of our three core tasks. And just some examples, at NATO, we each year since 2023 have issued the impact assessment. And so every year we really collect examples at NATO on the military side on seeing how that affects our security looking forward. And there's a lot of good examples. I have at the end of my presentation some links to some of these impact assessments. So I think it will be good inspiration for all of you. But it goes across, right? We talk about the different regions. We talk about the hazards that we really see intensifying as we're speaking at the moment. Interesting enough, we are now 10 years away from the Paris Agreement, and it was the goal to have emissions leveling out this year, which unfortunately is not happening. So we are moving more and more from the mitigation over to the adaptation. At the moment, especially speaking from Canada, forces are in growing demand, because although forces might not be the first responders, they are the only one who are really able to work on the forest fires that we see across the alliance, for example. But also looking at the Arctic, we have critical infrastructure being crippled by the thawing of permafrost. We have staff that actually are operating in other environments. It's not only extreme heat, which is clearly a big issue, but also how personnel actually survive in the more colder areas when it gets around 0 degrees and you get wet and frozen at the same time. It's really impacting how personnel can operate in these environments here. I guess we can come back to talk about at the end. And of course, the overall long-term human security efforts on how do we actually ensure that food, water, and livelihood for the people we are working with can be sustained. So there's a lot of interesting examples coming out from the impact assessment. Next slide, please. And just to highlight a few of them, I allowed myself to change the slide a little bit, because what most people are not aware of in the high north is that Russia is actually having more than 50% of the Russian soil are permafrost. And a lot of that is thawing. You can see the areas, especially along the coast, is thawing at the moment. So really putting huge strain on the infrastructure that Russia is seeing. And as Arctic is warming around 4 times the global average, this is not only affecting us, but it's definitely also affecting how our adversaries have to see the situation, how they have to put resources in maintaining the infrastructure. I guess we can come back to that discussion on our later presenter on how the whole energy infrastructure of Russia is affected by what's happening and the challenges they have there. But overall, this is a tough area to operate in, and we will have more and more activities happening in the Arctic. So what does it mean for how we set up our rescue operations? How does it mean how we actually work on preventing more coastal erosions and the protecting of the infrastructure that often are along the coastal areas in the Arctic? And this is something we specifically looking at the week I'm here. So that's just the high north. If you move to another area, next slide. And what actually the increasing temperatures are meeting both for the different temperatures in the water, but also in terms of salinity. So our sonars need to be calibrated much more often. It have to be specifically set up like it normally have to do when we operate sonars to the specific area we're operating in. But we're realizing that actually sonars and other equipment that look undersea need to be adjusted more regularly than it would otherwise be. Then comes the other issue of what does it actually mean for the fauna in undersea, and how does that affect also the populations that are at the coastal areas and living from the sea and in the areas we are operating. So we need to speak in specific regions. We need to make sure that we understand how we detect underwater activities and how we maintain and calibrate our equipment to actually continue to do that. So the whole support chain is also affected when we talk about submarine operations and anti-submarine warfare. And moving to another area, which could be in the north. So next slide. One of our newer bases where we are now starting to host the first F-35 in the northern part of Finland, in the Rovaniemi shooting and training area. Again here, there are permafrost thawing happening, which increase not only the infrastructure, the strain on the infrastructure, but really also the equipment that we need to have there as it's getting warmer and warmer, operating in an area where we will now have the land forces headquarters for the Joint Task Force North. So this is an example from different areas. I think the last slide I will show as an example is a rotary wing operations, and it's something we already started discussing when we were operating in Afghanistan. not only the dusty and dry conditions that cause more engine damage, but really also the ability to operate in warmer areas where there's less uplift. And we just had a discussion last week when I was at NATO HQ. We're looking also at how that affects the drones. And we need to be a little bit more forward-looking when we have autonomous system that operates in the air, that perhaps already in a few years we will have to operate in total different environments. And as we now are having autonomous system getting into the Arctic, this is also something we need to think about. How do we actually plan for equipment that can be used for a longer time and not only getting out of use in a few years? It might work fine in a Ukraine environment where we have high numbers of drones being lost when we operate directly. But if we actually want to have longer term equipment, we need to think more in how do we have autonomous system as well as our manned systems operating in the years ahead when we have temperatures changing so much and we have actually the weather being impacted with lots more humidity in the air because of the climate changes. So in a nutshell, what does it mean? These are a few good examples of how we are looking at things differently, but how do we actually then approach this as NATO? Next slide. So when the climate change and security action plan came together in 2021, part of the effort was also to look into how do we maintain this. So the action plan includes setting up the Center of Excellence that I'm now a part of. And a big part of what we're doing and what I'm actually doing as part of the outreach is really to understand better how does it affect us. I think we are not fully ready to understand how that is changing. There is a lot of individual research out there, but how do we actually put this research together to come up with concrete, actionable recommendations to the military? I still think we have we are lacking and fully understanding, also because some of the areas are very specific, depending on if you look into the North American Arctic or you look into the Scandinavian Arctic or you look into the Russian Arctic. They're all having different components and we need to understand them a little bit better. So there's a huge awareness work ongoing, and I'll come back to that in a later slide. I'm getting a text here that some cannot see the slides, but I'm sure you're working on that from ACO. I'm seeing it fine. I hope others are doing it as well. Then there's a whole mitigation efforts, and the mitigation efforts are continuing. There was a big focus on that in the beginning, where we actually thought we could reach some of the Paris Agreement goals. Now, when that is clear that it is unlikely to happen, that we can stick on 1.5, we of course still have to continue the mitigation and work. The NATO goals are still continuing. So as you see here, the goal is to operate on 45% emissions level by 2030. And moving towards net zero, which is an ongoing work that's happening at NATO HQ, of course, focusing on the fixed installation and a peacetime installation. And there's a huge focus on energy, moving over to some SAF, if that is possible, or using other fuel methods. And there's a lot of research going on as well. And I come back to what we do here at the CASCO on that. On the adaptation, that is just increasing efforts. Getting more requests to understand how the situation is and how can we then adapt to the new environment. How can we actually put that into defense planning? How can we set up the correct capabilities to make sure that the standards we're moving forward with are fitting into the environment we're going to be fighting in for the future? How do we include this into exercises? Do we have trainings available that actually touch on this, which is, I think, also an issue, that if we cannot really train the trainers or train key staff to understand what it is, then it's difficult to move things forward and moving into doctrine and changing other things in how we understand how we operate. The whole procurement guidelines need to be updated, and we need to have that discussion and including that in our procurement efforts. A lot of interesting work is happening there, I would say, to better understand how the requirements, specifications on procurement when we move forward on military equipment can be made resilient for the longer go. And of course, what linked up to the CIMIC community, I think the whole resilience focus. How do we make sure that our societies we're operating in are resilient, and how can the military boost that without degrading our efforts and our main focus, which of course is to deter and defend in the long end. But deterring and defending is also to be resilient in where we work. And finally, it's not only NATO, the European Union, a number of other actors, a number of interesting actors in Africa, the United Nations are looking into some of these things, and we are learning as we speak, and we need to actually put these things better together. So we moving from not the lowest common denominator, but moving forward from what we already have experienced and practices seeing when we are operating in different environments, and including the industry and academia, where they need to be on board from an early sort of, especially when we move into equipment, and academia is much of the awareness that we are including as we move forward. So we have put this together in the next slide, which is very dense, and I don't suspect you can actually see that. I hope you can see the slide later, but this is the key efforts that we are looking in from the action plan, really to make sure that we understand the vulnerabilities from geopolitical, operational, and institutional on the awareness side, moving into ensure an adaptation that we remain relevant, ready, and resilient on the adaptation side, and keep doing outreach to get the best practices. So I encourage you either to go to our website and have a look at that, or if you share the slides later. I'm sorry that it's very small letters, that it's difficult to see, but this is really one of our guiding principles on what we are working on when we come to the climate and security action plan at NATO, and also at our center, guiding a lot of the work that we are moving forward on. And again, adaptation is really the main efforts. I think it's 80% of what we do at the center, and 10% outreach and 10% mitigation. I think it's how we put things at the moment in our efforts. So the challenge remain, and I put that at the next slide, and I think it's a good also point to move for the discussions later. What I have been talking about is in a way theoretical, fine, so what does it actually mean? What is it we have to change? Sometimes it's difficult to operationalize what we see and make sure that a knowledge from Iraq is actually moving into understanding, changing doctrine, changing exercise, so it moves probably forward, or what we do within a nuke exercises in the Canadian area, on how civil-military cooperation could be enhanced in a disaster, and what the military rules is. We need to make sure we really operationalize this, and it's an ongoing challenge. I think that the center is really we will stand and fall with actually implementing, giving specific guidelines onto the military procurement side, into our exercises, into our doctrine and development. So we need at least to make sure that we have a shared understanding and coordination. For political reasons, it's not always possible, but at least on a scientific level, we can make sure that we can translate what we see from a science community over to a military understanding. And that's the third point here: the lack of systemic alignment with the wider transformational efforts. That we need to continue to talk together also on the defense research side, to make sure that nationally we're moving things from the defense research over to the military doctrine side. And although it's complex, as I put here at the end, we need to have a conceptual clarity, and this is, I think, the main efforts that the Allied Command Transformation is working on at the moment, and I will come to that now. Move to the next slide. So given these challenges, what is the Center of Excellence then trying to work on? And I just put 5 elements here. This is not all we are working on, but I think it's important that I highlight some of the different aspects here, that we harmonize data, we try to identify knowledge gaps, and specifically on the Arctic. We talk about NATO's operational concept that has been put in motion. It is ongoing, the development of NATO's operational concept led by ACT. How do we actually then exercise this in a way that enhance understanding, and how do we train that? And I will go more detail into some of these presentations here. So overall, Our main venue of bringing people together is on the next slide. It's a Montreal Climate Security Summit. We have now had the fourth one this year together with our Canadian partners, but it brings in primarily military practitioners, but researchers and others working in this field. We aim to be around 250. It's constantly interesting enough, despite developments in some of the allied countries where we thought there might be less interest. There was a huge demand to participate, so we have to enlarge the conference a little bit, but we really like to make it nimble and focused discussion, so we try to make it around 250 participants. We had a lot of detailed separate seminars where we really bring forward different issues. So this year we had 20 sessions. We try to focus on each of the domain. What do we know now of space? How do we know it being influenced both on the ground station, on how we operate our satellites, to the cyber domain, and how we have resilient cyber situation, how we look into misinformation, for example, on the cyber side to the other domains. We looked into each of the AORs, what are the main issues threatening the NATO's commands. We brought in commanders from the different JFCs to speak about what are the key defining threats. Interesting enough, Russia comes not out on the top priority, and we see climate change in the top two, which are threatening the Joint Force Command's ability to operate. That's how they see their own way moving forward. So that's super interesting. And the top expense from the climate misinformation. We have a really interesting project with Ukraine at the moment, looking into how Russia is utilizing climate misinformation to create more confusion. Or this specific disinformation. The disaster response, which of course it's huge at the moment, but the military and the civil military cooperation efforts are looking a lot into, but how can we handle that and prepare that in a way that doesn't bugger up or lock up our military efforts, so we remain ready and resilient and can continue to deter. The Arctic and the different Arctics is very interesting, so we look forward to that discussion later today. The wargaming and different ways of wargaming climate security is an effort that we think is super relevant, and we will continue developing wargames for different areas from the Sahel to the Arctic. And then going directly into talking to the nations about how do we actually mainstream climate change in defense spending. And finally, because this is a lot of elements we are working on, we have launched at the last summit our community of practice for climate security. The next slide. And you're welcome to join if you're interested, but we basically try to bring experts across from military, policy, science, and academia together to run discussions like you have done here, excellent, the CIMIC Center of Excellence, to move into, what are specific researchers really doing in one of the sub areas of climate change. So we somehow contribute to shaping a unified research agenda for the defense climate adaptation. So you can find it on the website as well, on our website. And we bring communities together of common interest that then make sure that we can continue discussions in a really specialized area for those who are interested in linking up with others doing the same type of research. Whether you're researching how you can better see ice thickness with satellites, or whether you're researching how you can operate sonar or undersea listening equipment better with for example, the civilian sector. Universities are also doing a lot of undersea listening when they're looking at mammals and animals operating undersea, and there's an interesting work happening there, how you can combine your research. So there's a number of interesting community of practice sub-elements on the climate security agenda. Another thing we're doing, next slide, is what we are here for. No, that's the data analysis. Oops, yeah, sorry, good. Which is the whole awareness part. There is a lot of data out there, and there's almost monthly the countries develop their own database looking into how they can better understand the threats. And a lot of this is just replication of using each other's data. But how are we actually setting standards to make sure that we are making the same decisions or the right decision based on a common understanding of the threat? What are the best practices when we move forward? can we really identify assumptions that we can stand by, so we can move together in how we adapt to these assumptions, and how we perhaps can mitigate some of the work that is happening out there. So the objective, and this data analysis workshop is also taking place this week. We have one currently with DSGL in UK, to move forward to get some tangible best practices, standards and guidelines when we look into climate data analysis used for the security sector. So this is an ongoing effort we have at the moment, and I think there are around 40 people gathered in Exeter this week, looking exactly on this, hosted by us, or organized by us, but hosted by the UK Defence Research Centre. And the next slide. What is actually on the high north and the Arctic regions? So we made a common effort together with other centers of excellence from the Energy Security and the Military Engineering Center of Excellence, joined by National Defence Research Centers from North America, Canada, but also over to a number of actors in Europe, to address climate change infrastructure and energy security challenges in the Arctic. And we are currently wrapping up phase 1 of this to do the analysis, and then moving into next year doing a bit more field implementation, especially focused on localized energy solutions. How do we actually sustain logistics, and the whole sustainability of forces when they're operating in a very tough area here. The initial findings, now we have 27 distinct climate-driven capability gaps. We are now validating these capability gaps together with our Canadian friends and the rest of the group from the other centers of excellence right now here in Halifax this week. And then we plan to move into a handful, 7, 10, we'll see where we end up, research priorities that we can look forward on, and some examples that we think will be useful to look more into from an Arctic perspective is a resilient permafrost infrastructure. It is our coastal and port adaptation to what's happening on climate change. It is also, the undersea operations and general resilient communications, logistics. So we will see where we come up. The report will be publicly available, I think, by end of January, February, primarily shared with our NATO partners, but good friends like the T. Stevens Center. We will be very happy to share this with you, and hopefully do some work together if you are interested in pursuing this. And my final slide, just coming back to the 3 other elements, the co-develop on NATO's operational concept. So there is a concrete tasking to the NATO military authorities to develop an operational concept by 27. It is led by ACT, but bringing other partners, of course. Casco is a strong partner of this, but also CMRE, the Center for Maritime Research and Experimentation, which is part of the NATO Scientific Organization, is part of this. And we hope to be able to come up with something more concrete by 27. The wargaming, as I mentioned, there is a number of activities happening in different countries, and we try to bring all the wargaming community together, like we did at the summit this year. And it might be useful to continue this, so we make sure at least we have the same standards. We might have different aims when we look into climate security, wargaming, but at least we should base it on some of the same standards. And finally, the training for the military personnel. We have been doing a number of activities, just including on existing training, but we are lacking a basic training at NATO. We have just set up an ADL course on climate change and security, so people can access that via the Joint Training and Analysis platform. The EU has developed a good curriculum on both training and on remote training. So we are sharing this, and we are co-developing a revision of both courses, both the NATO course and the EU course on climate security, to make sure that we have the same standards when we're moving forward. So you will see an update of these training activities coming through the year. But there's already interesting training that I can recommend for those of you who have access to the NATO training platform or to the EU training platform. So with that, I would move to the last slide. And again, this is not really visible, but I hope that you will be able to access the slides. I can just recommend, of course, the action plan is available on the NATO website. The latest impact assessment from 24 is also accessible to download. A lot of concrete examples of how that is impacting us, not so much what we can do about it, but more what is actually happening at the moment. The NATO scientific community have launched a really interesting report, especially focusing on what's happening on the Russia. So the SAS 182 report on climate change effect on security, I can recommend that. It's a huge scientific report. It needs to be digested, and we are now making some slides out of it to make sure that it's a little bit easier than reach hundreds of pages. But it's definitely there. It's well documented. And finally, as I mentioned, I can recommend the ADL intro course on climate change and security, on climate security and defense. And I would recommend also to reach out to us once you have taken the course, listing what you miss, or if you think something could be done differently. We will definitely continue to upgrade this to make it more accessible for the community. We might not be able to honor all requests, but it will help us at least to make sure that we adapt the training that is happening, both the week-long trainings we are doing at our center twice per year next year, and the training happening in the EU climate security, which will be around 3 times next year, to make sure that there is a general awareness, we understand better, and moving things forward from there. So with that, I will give the floor back to our facilitators. I'm happy to take a few questions now, or we can move to the break, and then we can continue the discussion after the break. Thank you so much.
Kim, have many thanks for that comprehensive introduction to our today's topic. I think we have learned already a lot. Thanks for taking care of the scene setter for today's seminar. I think that's desperately needed. Thanks for making us aware of the NATO climate change and security agenda as such, and the NATO climate and security action plan. I suppose these frameworks you were addressing shall be known by almost everybody working in the NATO security environment, as they kind of help us to understand and comprehend the challenges climate change is providing us with, but also introducing the connected actions. And that's what I like the most of your presentation, from awareness via mitigation and adaptation to outreach. So I suppose we keep the questions we have at hand for the Q&A session. And we move on to a 5 minutes break now, having a leg stretch for everybody. I think, Kim, you need the longest leg stretch because you have been talking for almost 40 minutes. And see you back in 5 minutes' time.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. I hope we didn't lose anyone. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Ms. Catherine Wong. Catherine is a global team leader for climate and security risk, and is principal technical advisor on climate, peace and security at the United Nations Development Programme, UNDP. Metrics to UNDP's Climate Hub and Crisis Bureau, she leads a team of more than 15 professionals and experts working on climate, environment, peace and security. Catherine serves as UNDP's focal point on the climate security mechanism and the UN water-led core group on leveraging water for peace. She also serves as a focal point on the steering committee on the Shared Waters Partnership. Catherine was recognized as one of 25 young security leaders by the Munich Security Conference and Körber Stiftung, and serves as an observer of the International Military Council for Climate and Security. Catherine's lead or co-leading author of more than 30 publications, including peer-reviewed journal articles, UN studies, and flagship publications on climate and environment, including climate, peace and security, and climate policy and financing. Catherine, thank you for coming today and joining us online. The floor is yours, and we look forward hearing your presentation.
Okay, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here and to contribute to this really important discussion today. I think during these particular times of heightened conflict, insecurity, humanitarian need, and at the same time facing increased challenges in terms of climate and environmental sustainability, there's a need to revisit our models for civil-military cooperation and our work across the humanitarian development and peace nexus. And hopefully, again, over the course of the next 15-20 minutes, I would be able here to offer you some perspectives in terms of the work that we're doing as a UN system, in particular the work of the Climate Security Mechanism and UNDP, and ways that we can better work together, again, in this model of CIMIC cooperation in times of climate crisis and conflict. So next slide, please. So I think, first of all, when we talk about the UN, I think it's important to stress that we're not talking about one single entity or organization, right? We're talking about different agencies, funds and programs with mandates across humanitarian development and peace. And what this implies is different sets of capabilities, different presences on the ground, different types of responses and different timelines as well. And so I think there are opportunities, again, for collaboration, again, across these different timeframes and in different geographic and in different regional contexts as well, working very closely with the Alliance, its member states and partners, and again, trying to find new ways to address traditional and non-traditional security threats, as was mentioned by Lieutenant Colonel Kim just now. I hope to be able to give, again, a quick perspective of some of the UN's responses in this space, and to stress again, as was mentioned just now as well, I think this is really a new and evolving field of policy and practice. And I think some of the answers, we are still trying to explore together with partners, and we would love to hear your perspectives too. In terms of challenges, very hard to cover in the space of 15-20 minutes, but I hope to highlight a few that I think could be important in terms of, again, looking for collaboration across these different silos, and again, trying to address problems collectively that we're not able to address by ourselves. For challenges and ways forward, I would love to offer a perspective on our work again as well. Next slide. So there's lots of different figures and data out there, and I think this sense-making process is really important for us as well. We can look at, as we have done traditionally in terms of climate as an environmental challenge, and the appropriate responses. We're able to conduct feasibility studies, to show technical feasibility, commercial availability of technologies. But we know that the climate crisis goes beyond this, right? It's not just an environmental phenomenon. And for many years now, we've been able to, I think, successfully unpack the impact on development, on livelihoods, on economy, on disasters as well. And, it would be, I think, anyone who's been watching the climate change negotiations or participating over recent years has seen developments, including in adaptation and loss and damage. But this broader piece of work about climate and humanitarian response, about climate change and its interactions with peace and security, really warrants our attention. And again, the data here, we can, this is just one example from ICRC, but we can also look at data on climate change in countries hosting refugees, climate change and climate change impacts in countries where there is a presence of UN peacekeeping operations, so on and so forth. And I think all of these different lines of inquiry point to the same direction, and that is we really need to look critically at climate change and make sure that we are incorporating climate change vulnerability, considerations of climate risk and climate hazards into our efforts on peace and security, so that we are climate proofing our responses to peace, stability, and insecurity, and making sure that our conflict analysis, that our stabilization strategies, that peace processes, so on and so forth, take into account climate change to ensure sustainability and to ensure operational effectiveness. I think the second point is, and again, when we're looking at this data, what we find out is that a lot of our work on adaptation, on resilience, on disaster risk reduction as well, takes place in some of the most conflict-affected, fragility-affected contexts in the world. And so there's a kind of reverse or flip side of this argument that means that we do need to look at conflict and make sure that conflict sensitivity is being considered in our adaptation and also mitigation efforts, right? That we're not, on the one hand, contributing to new conflicts, aggravating underlying causes of grievances, and that we're not overlooking political economy effects. And I think this is an important area of our work. And building on these two particular areas, I think the third point really is integrated approaches, win-win approaches to climate action, and sustaining and maintenance of peace and security, and that it needn't be an either-or approach here. That we are able to do both, to achieve climate action and help sustain peace and stability without compromising environmental integrity. Next slide. So in terms of some of the data and metrics, again, as the Lieutenant Colonel mentioned just now, a lot of the times, we have a lot of data on environmental hazards and climate hazards at the same time. And in addition to that, we're not only looking at exposure to those hazards, so which physical assets, which communities, which capabilities might be exposed to the climate hazards, but also their vulnerability to these particular hazards, right? And so we can have communities that may be in the same proximity that might be suffering from drought, but they might have very different outcomes. And so there's an important underlying understanding here of vulnerability, not only being biologically or biophysically constructed, but also the kind of socio-economic, political dimensions of vulnerability that we need to take into account. So I think these are these important elements of how we understand climate risk, peace and security, and the mediating effects or the mediating aspects here really relate to investments in adaptation, as we heard just now, and then in lieu of that, and in the short term and accompanying at the same time, coping strategies. And we can have negative or positive coping strategies. So this is really important, right? Where in communities we are seeing the failure of climate sensitive livelihoods, that we are providing alternative and diversified forms of livelihoods, that we are building coastal defences, that we are making sure that we are protecting ecosystems and ecosystem services, so on and so forth. So I think it's important to have this holistic view and perspective of risk, but it's important to also have this localized perspective. So together with our partners across the UN system, we have developed a toolbox for the integrated analysis of climate-related security risks, which does take into account, again, the political economy aspects mentioned just now, but also a holistic understanding of climate change vulnerability as it relates to risk. Next slide. So just moving away from some of the, I think, some of the theory, and again, some of the kind of technical approaches and how we're looking at the data and analysis, I would just propose to give you a quick overview of the work of the UN system in this space as well. Next slide. And the climate peace and security agenda. This is I would say highly atypical in terms of the climate change agenda, right? Because within the UN system, it began with the work of the UN Security Council. So back in 2007, we had the first ever open debate on climate security under the UK presidency. And I think it represented a particular trend at the time, again, of looking at non-traditional security threats. Later on we have Ebola, we also have AIDS, and so on and so forth over the years, right? So this particular moment in time, I think, was transformative. And in 2011, for the very first time, again under the German presidency, the Council was able and was mandated to look at climate-related risks for peace and security in specific regional and country contexts and mandates. And to date now, we have something like a dozen different resolution mandates on climate peace and security. So on the one hand, we have seen organisations within the UN system. We have seen key pillars. We have seen the Security Council, the Peace Building Commission, again, take various different positions here and attempted again to climate-proof the UN's efforts on peace and security. On the flip side of this, if we're looking at global climate governance, we're looking at international negotiations on climate change. It's quite a different scenario. I mean, if we take the peace agreement, so we take the Paris Agreement, even for example, or the Kyoto Protocol, UNFCCC. What we find is that there isn't a single reference to conflict, fragility, or peace or security. So there's no, I guess, inherent underlying understanding again of this kind of nexus between climate change and humanitarian peace, crisis and fragility impacts. And so it's been, I think, certainly a challenge to work across the nexus with various different actors to make sure that they do have this, again, this informed perspective of risk. And I think the turning point really began at COP27, so 3 years ago, with Egypt and the Climate Responses for Sustaining Peace initiative, which really for the first time in the context of climate change negotiations put a perspective to the need to have a lens on sustaining peace in terms of climate change mitigation, adaptation, financing, but then also issues related to forced displacement and migration. And this effort has continued through COP28. We saw the Declaration on Climate Relief, Recovery and Peace, supported by more than 90 member states and 40 institutional partners, including the World Bank, various UN organizations and other international financial institutions. And with the Baku Hub, COP29, we have an institutionalization, I think, of this approach. And again, broad-based mandates, pilots that really try to demonstrate what this can look like on the ground. So I think a very high level, we see different actors now in the peace and security space and also in climate, again, converging around the need to address some of these risks. At a regional level, the work of the African Union Commission on the common African position on climate, peace and security, I think, has been instrumental in shaping efforts across the continent. We see sub-regional efforts by Lake Chad Basin Commission, the Liptako Gorm Authority. We also have the Bamako Declaration by 10 Sahelian states that was launched 2 years ago as well. Again, trying to address some of these issues and localize the challenges and find responses that really are ground truth by the realities in these particular regions. The same in the Pacific, so we have the Boy Declaration, again, which identifies climate change as the #1 threat to regional security. And again, a new action plan in making that, again, endeavors to look at some of these responses. In terms of responses, I think, again, there's I'll come back to this point, I think, at the very end and offer some quick examples of what we're doing in terms of our own work. Next slide. So in terms of emerging trends that are relevant to civil-military cooperation, I think I would probably start at the top here. Next slide. In terms of what we're seeing at the moment in terms of displacement trends, and I think somehow this is a blind spot for so much of our work on climate, and so much of our work on forced displacement at the same time, which has really been driven around responses to displacement that is related to violent or armed conflict, right? And so last year, this is data by the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center. We saw for the very first time cumulative displacement at an all-time high. Over the last 10 years, again, year-upon-year increases to 84 million at the end of last year. I think if we unpack these numbers, what we see is something else that is very startling and particularly important here. And that is, apart from the cumulative figures, if we're looking at annual data, climate change outpaces conflict as the #1 driver of displacement each year now. And that is taking into account conflicts that we're seeing in Ukraine, in Sudan, in DRC, and among other places. So this is a grave concern for us. If we look at a country level and how this plays out as well, displacement is becoming increasingly prolonged. According to IOM, displacement now averages anywhere between 10 to 26 years. Across 50 countries, we see an average level of displacement or duration of displacement of at least 10 years. So I think if we are gaming this out, if we're looking at what the scenarios and how they will unfold in future years, by mid-century, it's estimated that climate-related displacement will likely contribute to somewhere between 200 million and 1.2 billion internally displaced persons across the world. So I think in terms of what the responses are, again, how we need to make sure that we are better understanding these trends, particularly when we look at the Geneva Convention, for example, which only takes into account, which addresses directly and specifically political asylum, which responds to the needs of refugees and not climate refugees, which itself is a misnomer. I think this is something that is a critical area of concern for us in terms of what we're doing. Greater efforts and investments, I think, from the part of the UN in terms of understanding the trends of trying to help national authorities develop dedicated policies and strategies for climate relocation to respond to climate displacement as well. Ultimately, I think what we hear from communities is that they don't want to leave, that they don't want to move. And so a lot of the times, our best responses can be these critical investments in situ adaptation, making sure that communities, that people that want to stay have the opportunity to stay and to stay with dignity or move if needed, and the structures and policies and strategies are in place to ensure protection of those in the move and also support receiving and hosting communities at the same time. 2012, we had the first ever legally binding convention, the Kampala Convention on climate displacement across sub-Saharan Africa. So there are different, I think, milestones that we're looking at, but again, still an evolving space which would warrant better collaboration again across the nexus. Next slide. Apart from increasing levels of displacement, last year, we saw for the first time the highest number of conflicts in the post-war period, some 60 conflicts, and the profound effects that they're having on the built environment, but at the same time, our natural environment. The toll in terms of loss of lives, of livelihoods, homes, and communities. We know that now, I think, much more clearly than ever before, that the environmental impacts of war will have a greater toll on human suffering for many years to come, long after conflict has ended. And this has been exemplified, it's been highlighted by various different UN bodies. That's the United Nations Environmental Assembly in terms of protection of the environment and areas affected by armed conflict. We also have the recent UN Security Council debate under the Sierra Leone presidency, again looking at environmental impacts of war. And in terms of UNDP and its work, I think this monitoring piece, again, having and documenting this data, again, on environmental damages is critically important. We've been able to do this with the support of the government of Sweden, with mobile units around country. And there are some, I think, some connections here that we really need to make better. We're looking at forest fires, and we have the highest level of forest fires that we've seen in recent years, about 1 million hectares of land, acres of land that have been affected. And there's a climate change signal or kind of risk here that we need to think about. With increased aridity, with increased heat, we have increased intensity of forest fires. And at the same time, with unexploded ordnance, it makes it ever so much more challenging for firefighters to be able to respond to these forest fires as well. So I think some of these, again, some of these challenges need to be unpacked in the short term, but again, the longer term impacts we are still trying to assess as well. And there are different examples. There's one that I think our advisor with the Lake Chad Basin Commission refers to in the Sahel, in Chad, and that is the deployment of mines during the war with Libya back in the 70s. And so we have unexploded ordnance, and with land degradation, with climate change, with flooding, we now find unexploded ordnance in water bodies and also areas that were not previously affected by mines as well. So these complex interactions between climate change and insecurity, and again, the longer term impacts of war on the environment and how they will affect access to land, will affect access to food and adaptation in future, really warrant our attention. Next slide. I think another area that has been important in terms of our engagement with NATO member states and broader partners of the alliance has been this piece around climate change and violent extremism. And there's a lot of, I think, misinformation in this space. Again, really an area that does warrant our attention. This photo dates back to more than 10 years ago. It's to Abu Gharaib and the willful flooding opening of the floodgates of the Fallujah Dam. And here, 100 kilometers away in Abu Gharaib, you see communities, tens of thousands of people whose homes were destroyed, their livelihoods and land as well. And I guess this particular example, it's somehow surprising, but not so surprising, one could also say as well, given the increased challenges that we see for the weaponization of natural resources, of water and of energy infrastructure in times of war, but then also by armed groups and violent extremist organizations. So I think this is a particular area that we are looking at in terms of our work on climate peace and security. And there's a challenge in terms of not only areas which are vulnerable to attack by violent extremist organizations. And again, these tactics that are being used in highly resource-constrained contexts, but it's also the responses and how such organizations can take advantage of these opportunities to, first of all, strengthen their legitimacy in times of climate crisis and conflict. You know, in the case of Islamist groups, in Sahel, we saw that following climate disasters, following droughts, following floods, that they were there providing response, typically as a humanitarian organization might be doing. In the case of Somalia, Al-Shabaab opened a COVID center at the time as well. So, you know, there's a broader question, I think, about what is happening when we are not delivering on our climate commitments, right? And who is providing those responses if we're not? And again, how they're able to adjust their tactics, again, in these particular times of hardship when communities are at their most vulnerable. When we have something like 200 million people who live in areas with little presence of the state, again, there's I think a broader piece here that we also need to look at in terms of access to adaptation, access to energy. I'll come back to this point as well. In areas again with little presence of the state, and what we're doing, and again what else that we need to do. And again, I think this CIMIC piece can be really important in terms of delivering on human security, on dignity, but also the broader elements of peace, stability, and security, and international peace and security as well. Next slide. I wanted to come back to a point that was mentioned by Lieutenant Colonel Kim as well, in terms of another key area for further collaboration. And I think this is something that often goes overlooked. If we're talking about communities that are most vulnerable to climate, that are suffering from conflict, many of them have very little access to energy as well. And we can look at levels of access to energy, and we'll see that they increase over the years. We have something like 650, 700 million people who don't have access to energy globally. But if we're talking about energy poverty, and that's a much bigger indicator and evokes a much larger group as well, then we're looking at something like 1.2 billion people around the world. And renewable energy solutions in these contexts can provide a multitude of different co-benefits, not only direct access to energy, but a lifeline in terms of basic and emergency response, and can help meet needs at a local level, even when we don't have grids operational and a national level, right? So it's possible to have locally deployed solutions. And I think this is the critical. You know, we look at our work in Ukraine, for example. UNDP has deployed somewhere like 500 megawatts of new installed capacity in solar and other types of renewables. Again, being able to respond to the need while the war is ongoing. At the same time, in refugee camps and other communities that are hosting IDPs, there's a gap in terms of access to energy by those on the move. And again, communities that are receiving internally displaced persons and refugees. And so this access to energy piece, I think, really needs to be, I think, at least one of the core kind of fundamental levers or priority areas in terms of our climate peace and security responses. The flip side of this is the challenges for major economies around the world in terms of getting to net zero. And if we're able to meet any of these scenarios under the Paris Agreement, right, we're looking at 40 of the most dependent economies on fossil fuels. And there's an excellent study here by UNDP for colleagues who are not so familiar with it. But there's the challenge here that, you know, we're looking at somewhere between 12 and 14 trillion dollars of oil rents that will be lost from now up until 2040 to be able to get to any, again, scenario that is compatible with the Paris Agreement. And this is a challenge when these economies don't have sufficient resources to be able to transition to low carbon technologies. It's also a broader challenge here in terms of the critical minerals that are needed to develop green technologies. And the World Bank estimates that we need a five-fold increase in current levels of extraction, again, to be able to get to net zero. And that's by mid-century. So I think that really gives us pause for thought as well. And again, speaks to broader geopolitical challenges that we need to consider beyond our current understanding of, again, technical capabilities and what these technical scenarios look like. Next slide. So just in terms of just challenges and ways forward, I think a lot of the times we tend to point to gaps in financing. We tend to talk about policy gaps, but we have been working over the last few years to provide dedicated training to policymakers, to negotiators, to peace and security experts on climate peace and security, and try to help fill some of those gaps. And I think some of their answers were really interesting. Altogether, we trained something like 245 government officials, regional organizational officials from 80 different countries. And they speak to, again, 70 to 80% spoke to challenges related to finance. I don't think it was surprising for us, you know, that those working on climate were primarily contributing to nationally determined contributions, contributing to national adaptation plans over the years, so on and so forth, and that very few of them had the chance to engage in peace and security and vice versa. But I think there are some interesting findings that I would like to quickly share here with you. Next slide. And I think the first one is, and you know, we surveyed each of them as part of this process on onboarding them into one of our training programs. And it was very surprising to see that some 2/3, again, of policymakers in countries that are affected by climate and humanitarian need, that some 60% of them identify climate peace and security as an area of high priority or very high priority for their country or region. And most specifically, a third of them identify gaps or risks in terms of climate change and forced displacement and migration. And another third of policymakers identified the number one risk in terms of resource scarcity and increased competition for natural resources, including land, including water, pasture, and so on and so forth. I think the other finding here that is surprising is that, or maybe not surprising, I'll put that to you, but that less than a third of policymakers and experts working on climate had any interaction with other officials in the same government on peace and security, and vice versa. And I think this really points to a kind of a clear opportunity in terms of what we can do here in terms of building this community of practice that was mentioned earlier, and trying to make sure, you know, that we get to solutions that are greater than the kind of the sum of the parts, so to speak. Next slide. As mentioned at the beginning, just a quick overview of some of our work, a snapshot of some of our work within the UN system. The UN Climate Security Mechanism, I think, has been a hub for innovation, a hub also for implementation on climate peace and security within the UN. We have 10 advisors deployed not only to special political missions and peace operations, but also regional organizations in the South with key partners, again, for the Alliance, its member states, and other broader locally based actors here in our different neighborhoods. And, you know, we have a survey of practice that I think highlights some of the examples. So there'll be opportunities here, I think, to connect to quite concrete pieces of work that are going on the ground. Next slide. I think I started with a map, right? So maybe good to finish with one as well. But here's a quick snapshot of some of our programming portfolio. I think it's been really, important to provide some proof of concept that what we're doing in terms of our climate portfolios, but also our peace building, our stabilization work, that it does make sense that we do have this kind of clarity of concept that was mentioned earlier, and again, what climate peace and security looks like, and that we're not just doing climate in conflict-affected contexts, or not just doing more conflict prevention, peace building, or peacekeeping work with a different framing or narrative, right? But that we are really trying to get to these win-win solutions that were mentioned earlier. Thank you so much. I'll stop here and hand back over to our moderators.
Okay, thank you so much, Catherine. I didn't stop writing down notes of further ideas for research and so on, so it was super interesting. Thank you so much for this presentation. I think we all learned a lot, and I will hand over to Ralph for introducing our last speaker of the day.
Okay, then let's hit the next slide. Yeah, I would like to introduce the last speaker of our today's online seminar, Dr. Matthew Rhodes. Dr. Matthew Rhodes is a professor of international security and course director of the NATO in the North course at the Ted Stevens Center for Arctic Security Studies in Anchorage, Alaska, USA. He holds a PhD in political science from the University of Wisconsin and previously served on the faculty of the George C. Marshall Center in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, Germany, the U.S. Air War College at Maxwell Air Force Base, Alabama, and the Department of Politics and European Studies at Palach University in Olomouc, Czech Republic. He is the author of numerous articles, book chapters, and policy papers dealing with U.S. foreign policy, transatlantic relation, and European security. Matthew, it's a pleasure having you with us, and we are really looking forward to your presentation.
No, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I appreciate very much the work of the Center of Excellence for CIMIC. And in fact, I believe the invitation to be here today came from a contact at the Montreal Security Summit in 2024. So it shows a little bit, this is the institution of Kim McLaughlin, and it shows a little bit some of the mutual support and interaction among organizations in this field. I'll also just underline the point that Colonel Bauer made in his initial introduction, that the remarks I'll make today simply reflect my own personal views. Next slide, please. We already heard a bit from Kim McLaughlin about the Arctic. I think for most of my now fairly long life, the Arctic was a very quiet place, even almost boring. Yeah, you never really heard much about it. That has changed in the last 5 to 10 years. And you see from some of these recent comments by the leaders on the screen, the Arctic is now more and more at the center of our discussions of international relations and international security. And I think for the purposes of our discussion here today, perhaps the most relevant one is the last one on the screen, the one from EU Commission President and former German Minister of Defense, Ursula von der Leyen, that the Arctic is the place on the planet where nature and geopolitics are clashing most intensely. And so all of this is forcing us to adapt and think about what it means for security and for how we deal with our defense. Next slide, please. So as I talk about the Arctic, I will try to underline a little bit about why it's becoming more important, and then in the spirit of this particular seminar, give some examples of civil military areas where NATO and its allies are responding. But first, I guess, in terms of definitions, where is the Arctic? What is it that we're actually talking about here? The most common definition of the Arctic region is the area above the Arctic Circle. That's the line you can see mostly here on the map at 66 and 2/3 degrees north latitude. It comes from the fact that this is the line where for at least one day on the winter solstice, you have a total day of darkness. And then conversely, on the counterpart, summer solstice in June, you have one day of total daylight. There are a couple of modifications or variations on this definition. For example, in the United States, a law from the mid-1980s, the Arctic Research and Policy Act, extended this line a little bit into central Alaska and the Aleutian Island chain in the North Pacific as being within the Arctic. We also have heard already a bit today this related term of high north. Traditionally, especially within NATO, this has referred to the European Arctic, especially kind of the northern parts of Scandinavia and perhaps northwest Russia. But you also sometimes hear this increasingly in recent years referring to the Arctic, the transpolar Arctic as a whole. So keep in mind that these terms are sometimes used interchangeably, but sometimes with different emphasis. Next slide, please. And I think one of the main reasons that the Arctic is getting so much more attention, and again, perhaps more attention in the last 5 to 10 years than in the previous 1,000, is the sense that it's becoming more accessible. You still see, especially from this slide, that a majority of the Arctic, by whichever definition you're using, is actually composed of water. It's the Arctic Ocean and some of the adjoining northern seas. It is still the case that for much of the year, these waters are frozen over with sea ice. This particular map shows the extent of that sea ice at the maximum in the February-March timeframe, which is shown here in dark blue, as well as the minimum in the summer, usually September. That's this part in the center of the map in white. But because of the trends that are already discussed, Kim McLaughlin mentioned that the Arctic is thought to be warming about 4 times faster than the global average. The extent of the sea ice is becoming both smaller in terms of the area it covers and thinner in terms of its kind of solidity and thickness, which kind of is opening up the Arctic, making it more navigable for longer parts of the year. There are even predictions that by the middle of this century, perhaps the Arctic Ocean will be nearly ice-free in the summer, opening it up even more. Next slide, please. And so that is continuing to fuel interest, the idea that the Arctic is not going to be just a closed area, but potentially more open. So it's of interest not just to the 8 Arctic countries themselves that are shown here in turquoise, countries that have some territory above the Arctic Circle, but also increasingly other non-Arctic states. These include the dozen countries shown here in dark blue that are official observers in the Arctic Council, one of the main international organizations that has been dealing with the Arctic the last 3 decades. But there are also others as well that in various ways are expressing interest. Next slide. And again, if you think about those countries on the prior page in particular, they are major manufacturing and trading states. And at least a big part of their interest is driven by the sense that the economic potential of the Arctic is increasing and may become very lucrative in the next couple of decades. It will, for a long time, be a challenging place to operate and make money. But the sense is if you make some small investments now, perhaps they will pay off in a big way and that the risk will be worth it in 10 to 20 years. Part of this is driven by the sense that is suggested on the part of the slide here on the left of the various economic resources that are available in the Arctic. And these have actually already through history been an important part of the Arctic's economic development. Go back even a couple of centuries, you can see that the Arctic was attractive as a place to get animal furs, maybe sables in Siberian Russia. Things like fish are plentiful in much of the Arctic. Cod, salmon, halibut are popular also here in Alaska. Gold was important in the Yukon area of northwest Canada and Alaska at the end of the 19th century. And more recently in the 20th century, energy resources, oil and natural gas, have been very plentiful in the region. They play a big part in the economy of Alaska. And by a couple of statistics I saw recently, currently Arctic energy production accounts for roughly 25% of global natural gas and around 10% of global petroleum. And estimates are that in terms of undeveloped or undiscovered reserves, the shares are even a little bit greater than that. So as the Sea ice thins, and as technology for extraction develops, there's a thought that these could become, economically viable resources. And last but not least, I think for the 21st century economy, the Arctic is also a location for an estimated 31 of 34 so-called critical or rare earth minerals. These are things like lithium, maybe also cobalt and rhodium, that are key components for batteries, for advanced electronics, and other components for everything from almost every new car to military equipment such as fighter jets. So the access to these kinds of minerals can become even more important for the 21st century economy as well. Now, and that's not just resources that the Arctic is becoming of greater interest in. The other side of the slide shows that there's also growing interest in the potential for more maritime passage around and through the Arctic. There are a couple of key routes that are shown on this map. You see, for example, the Northern Sea Route, which goes over along the Russian Siberian coast. You see also the Northwest Passage through the Canadian archipelago. And it's thought that, for example, that these can cut significant time off traditional transit, for example, between Asia and Europe through the Suez Canal. For example, I think one of the recent records was a Chinese ship went from a Chinese port to Northwest Europe this September in just 18 days. Which was less than the standard 40 days through the Suez Canal. And as a bonus, you didn't have to deal with Somali pirates or Houthi rebels firing missiles at the ship. So this could really cut down the time and cost of transit. The Northwest Passage through Canada is still a little bit more difficult to transit. There was a case that same month in September of a Dutch flag ship, the Themsburg, that was coming through the Northwest Passage, but got stuck in the ice for 30 days and had to be freed. But you're beginning to see more cargo going through the Northwest Passage rather than the Panama Canal as well. And there's also increasing, kind of recreational cruises going through there. And if you have an extra 35,000 euros in your pocket and want to take a cruise from Greenland to Alaska, you can book this in the summer months as well. And again, if the transpolar route over the North Pole does open up later in the next couple of decades, that would cut times and cost to an even greater extent. Next slide. And these kind of economic aspects overlap a bit with geopolitical competition, in particular with Russia and China. Now, NATO documents, including the strategic concept, identify Russia as the greatest immediate threat to the security of NATO and its members. They also identify China as a challenge to its security and interest. So concern with them is part of this overall kind of combination of nature and geopolitics that President von der Leyen mentioned. Russia, as Kim McLaughlin already mentioned, is the largest Arctic state. Its coastline accounts for just a little bit more than half of the overall Arctic Ocean coastline. But China is also, although it's not in the Arctic, is asserting a certain interest and perhaps claim to co-governance of the region. Its 2018 Arctic strategy famously referred to itself as a near Arctic state, so a state with special interest and involvement in the region. And perhaps more importantly, and of concern to some of NATO and its members, is the way the two countries have been cooperating and aligning their efforts in the region. In February of 2022, just a few weeks before Russia's all-out invasion of Ukraine, President Putin and President Xi signed a so-called Treaty on Friendship Without Limits. And a lot of where this treaty has been implemented involves the Arctic. and in fact has involved economically allowing China to become one of the chief enablers of Russia's ongoing war effort against Ukraine. If you see kind of the first square at the bottom, it again shows some of the Silk Road trade routes. And China has sought to replace some of the lost Russian markets with the West as it has imposed sanctions against Russia to become one of the biggest buyers of Russian energy, shipped both via Arctic Siberian pipelines as well as in ships over the Northern Sea route. In return, China sends things like dual-use components for the Russian defense industry and civilian economy that are sanctioned by the West. There also has been an increase in joint Chinese and Russian military activity in the Arctic, including joint air and naval exercises off the U.S. Alaskan Arctic coast. And maybe even more concerning, there has been a kind of collaboration or alignment of efforts in hybrid or gray zone activity. And we have seen this, for example, in the mapping and sabotage of critical undersea infrastructure. One of the first cases of this was a mysterious cutting of a data cable between the Norwegian mainland and the Svalbard archipelago in January of 2022. But there have been since then a number of other cases involving Russian and Chinese vessels, also in the subarctic Baltic Sea region. And of course, a range of other sabotage efforts in the European continent in the last several months. So taken together, all those things have raised concerns. Next slide, please. Now, in reaction to these developments, as we already have heard a bit from Kim McLaughlin and other speakers, NATO has tried to transform its posture and response, especially in the high north. This particular slide comes from Major General Matthew von Wagenen, who just retired last month as the Deputy Chief of Staff at NATO's military command at SHAPE. And it points out things like this new regional command. And I think we saw a comment in the chat of the NATO Nordic countries being officially transferred to this command in Norfolk last week. It's improving kind of reconnaissance and early warning systems. And importantly, I think for this seminar, many of these steps involve CIMIC, civil-military cooperation. Next slide, please. This is the standard definition recopied from the Center of Excellence website. And it emphasizes, I think, nicely that this kind of mutual understanding, integration and interaction among civil and military components is a key part of the CIMIC concept and a key part of the response to Arctic security challenges by NATO and its members. And I'll spend just a few minutes then to follow, giving a few examples of how this has been playing out. Next slide, please. One of the most notable ones is what is called the Icebreaker Collaboration Effort, or ICEPACT, illustrated here by a graphic from the US State Department. This was a plan for industrial cooperation among the three countries shown here, the United States, Canada, and Finland, for the construction of more icebreaker vessels needed to operate in Arctic regions for use by the three countries themselves, as well as for potential sale to other NATO allies and partners. This was first signed by the top leaders of the three countries on the margins of the NATO summit in Washington, D.C. in July of last year. And under implementing agreements signed just in the last several weeks, there is a plan for some of the first activity to involve the construction in the next decade and a half of 11 new icebreakers for the United States, involving the first 4 of those to be constructed in Finnish shipyards with involvement of Canadian companies by the end of this decade, and then the follow-on 7 ships to be built in shipyards in the United States with the assistance of Finnish and Canadian expertise and investment. So this, I think, is important to enhancing the ability of the United States to operate in the region along with its partners. And these ships will be built for the U.S. Coast Guard, which itself is kind of an inherently civil and military kind of organization. Its traditional civilian missions include maritime safety and rescue. They involve support to scientific research, which is important especially for the types of issues we're discussing here today. And they involve law enforcement, counter drug and counter other kinds of smuggling operations. But they also have a military authority and missions to defend the homeland, especially in northern waters, and provide presence for sovereignty and so forth. So strengthening these efforts and its capacities for those missions as the Arctic becomes more important is needed. The U.S. Coast Guard currently has only 3 icebreakers, most of which are a couple of decades old nearing the end of their useful lives. So this addition of 11 new icebreakers will significantly strengthen its capacity for work for national and international cooperation. Next slide, please. A bit more briefly, there's also a NorthLink initiative. This is a NATO high visibility project that was approved by NATO defense ministers in October of last year. There are currently 13 allies participating in this initiative. And the idea and what makes it kind of a CIMIC type initiative is that the countries involved want to improve their ability to leverage commercial satellites also for military communications in the Arctic and high north. Because of the geology involved, currently there is very limited satellite coverage in the Arctic, especially above about 80 degrees latitude. Most satellites are kind of closer to the equator region. And so creating more satellite capacity there will be important to fill in gaps in communication in the north. Next slide. And then finally, there's also among the 3 Scandinavian NATO members, especially as Sweden and Finland have recently joined the alliance, to improve east-west road and rail links in those countries' far northern territories. Currently, there is very limited infrastructure there, so the respective ministries of defense and transportation are coordinating on plans to strengthen and enhance those transportation links in ways that should simultaneously encourage economic development and presence in those regions, as well as provide for greater opportunities to move military equipment and personnel in those regions in the case of a potential emergency. So all those things, I think, are examples of what NATO and its members are engaged in. There are certainly many others. But I will just wrap up by maybe returning to the words of President von der Leyen, that the Arctic is a place that will demand not just more and more of our attention in the years ahead, but perhaps even a change of mindset. We'll need to think more about how operating in this strange, unusual place makes us rethink what we work on in light of some of the operational challenges that Kim McLaughlin also mentioned. And I think we'll see that many of the answers to those challenges will involve both civil and military elements, and thinking about ways they can cooperate more effectively together. So that brings me to the end of my formal presentation. I'll look forward to the opportunity to engage in questions with the audience.
Matthew, have many thanks. What an impressive presentation. Thanks for taking us on the journey to the Arctic and relating the impact of climate change within the Arctic region to its implications for NATO and to NATO civil military cooperation, CIMIC in particular. That's really appreciated. I think we have seen a good set of presentations that makes us deserving a 5-minute slack stretch, and after that one, we are really looking forward for our participants to engage with you, Matthew, Catherine, and Kim. So we have the chance to meet you again. So let's take a lecture of 5 minutes, be back in 5 minutes time, and then we hit the Q&A session for making us getting engaged with you, the experts. Thanks.